I must say it's an incredible honor for me to be here to speak to this group. And I sing your praises literally across the country. In one of my capacities, I lecture in major cities, small towns, and one of my jobs is to teach doctors, both sleep doctors and non-sleep doctors, about narcolepsy. And one of the first things I always start off with in a discussion with them is I ask them the question if they've ever been to a meeting of the Narcolepsy Network. And of course, most of them say no. And I said, well, if you ever want to learn something far beyond anything I'm going to teach you, or far beyond anything you're ever going to read in a textbook, you should attend one of these meetings. Talking to patients, one after one, and their families will give you better insight and better tools to treat the disease than anything you can get from a lecture or a book. And for that, I think all of you deserve a round of applause. When I was asked to give this talk, the topic was, can you explain narcolepsy in terms that everybody can understand? And I think that was a huge task because I know so many doctors who don't understand it. And the patients with narcolepsy are struggling to understand it because they look to their physicians for guidance, and unfortunately, too often the physicians know less than the patients do. And that's a very sad state of affairs. Even, I hate to say it, among my colleagues who are, quote, sleep doctors. So having meetings like this and working with researchers across the United States and now across the world, we are making tremendous strides. And what I would like to do this morning in presenting to you is a little bit of a history of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. I've always said that if I hadn't become a physician, I would have been an historian, because history is the key to the present and the future. And unless you know where you've been, you have no idea where you're going. All right. That was only a 11-minute technical glitch, a mere speck in time. All right, as I said, this is a cartoon that was made by the Swiss and Italian sleep specialists, and I thought it would be a very interesting way to start the talk, so here we go.
This is the story of Alice. Alice is 12 and is a very likable girl. She has many friends. They meet often and have a lot of fun together. She has a very nice family who love her. She's very active. She likes to play, dance, and has lots of interests. Then something changes. At night, Alice doesn't sleep well. She wakes often. She has nightmares. Sometimes she feels trapped in her bed. And during the day, she always feels tired. She falls asleep everywhere. Also at school, she has trouble staying awake, and the teacher gets angry. When classmates make fun of her, Alice feels more and more alone. Her parents bring Alice to the doctor. At the beginning, nobody understands, but finally, Alice meets a good doctor. Thanks to the tests at the sleep center, they discover the cause. Alice has narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a neurological illness which causes an altered sleep pattern. The brain is unable to regulate the body functions and doesn't know when to rest and when to stay awake. The main symptom is daytime sleepiness, which is manifested as irresistible attacks of sleep that can occur at different moments of the day. You suddenly feel the need to sleep, even if you have other things to do, and you fall asleep often at inopportune moments. Another symptom characteristic of narcolepsy is cataplexy, which manifests as unforeseen episodes of loss of muscle strength provoked by an emotion, often a nice one like laughter or a surprise. Also, sleep is disturbed because of awakenings, and falling asleep or on awakening visions can appear, often frightening, like experiencing nightmares with open eyes. These are called hypnagogic hallucinations. Often, these hallucinations are accompanied by the impossibility to move for some minutes. They are really shocking experiences called sleep paralysis. The body still sleeps, but the brain is already awake. Today, Alice feels better. Her doctors have helped her thanks to a correct diagnosis and the proper treatment. We have briefly presented with its main symptoms, narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a curable illness. If you recognize the symptoms that we have described, talk about them with your doctor or contact the sleep center nearest to you. 18 March 2010, First European Narcolepsy Day.
I thought that was fascinating. And it's something that can be used in schools, it can be used in community groups, it can be used in patient support groups, and I think this is actually, as it said, the European Narcolepsy Union put this together. I think that we here can do an equal job and disseminate it across the states. So I think it's a very good thing to think about. Okay. So now let's get to the meat of the presentation. This is my disclosure slide. I will make every attempt not to make this any commercial kind of presentation. We will be using both generic terms, and for the sake of the audience, I will show you what the brand names for those generic terms are. When I looked at the history of narcolepsy, it became very clear to me that there were three stages in the scientific development of the idea that went into narcolepsy, and I was able to separate them out into three distinct phases. The first phase is the longest, 59 years, and this is the timeline that you see starting in 1877, going all the way to 1935. During that 60 years or so, you had the original description of narcolepsy. Between 1877 and 1880, the first two papers on the description of the disease were published. The real breakthrough was a French physician by the name of Galeno, and he was actually the first to coin the term narcolepsy. So from 1880 until 1902, it was an interesting description. Not too many people understood it, and the kind of development that it took in terms of basic science and neurophysiology was at that time in its very early developmental stages. Parts of the brain that govern sleep were unknown, and the idea that even sleep was a function of the brain was unknown. And the idea that muscle weakness or cataplexy was part of this was not really described until 1902. Then, as the years went on into just before World War I, Henneberg described cataplexy. Very interesting paper was published in 1926 by a neurophysiologist by the name of Adie. And in those days, doctors had to write theses in order to get their MD degrees. And Adie actually wrote a thesis on narcolepsy. It was the first complete and thorough review of the state of the art, given the fact that it was 1926. And then a very interesting thing happened in the world, and that's something called the Spanish flu. Spanish flu was an H1N1 avian flu, and it decimated Europe, and there were thousands of deaths here in the United States. The interesting thing about the avian flu was more than its flu-like symptoms, because it had some very, very specific sleep factors, including people who developed excessive daytime sleepiness, people who developed severe insomnia, and if you survived, and the survival rate was approximately 50%, you were left very frequently with something that we now know today as a Parkinsonian or Parkinson's disease-like state. There was a German physician by the name of Konstantin von Economo who studied this and probably studied it better than anybody. He actually looked at the brains of patients who had died, and he found lesions in the hypothalamus. And he was able to segregate those patients who had insomnia from those patients who had excessive sleepiness into different parts of the hypothalamus. This was the very first time that anybody was able to designate specific parts of the brain to sleep. No neurophysiologist, no physician, nobody had ever been able to do that before. And he presented a paper in 1929 to the Columbia University School of Medicine, and he called it On the Localization of Sleep. It was a breakthrough in terms of people understanding that sleep is controlled by the brain, and there are specific centers in the brain that control wakefulness and control sleep. It was a revolutionary discovery. In 1935, the first description of a useful drug was made, and that was the use of amphetamines to treat excessive daytime sleepiness in those patients with narcolepsy. A few years prior to that, 1931, a paper was published showing that ephedrine, which was a drug in those days available over the counter, much like it was up until a few years ago, but it was used, as it always has been, as an alerting agent. It's also used as a decongestant. But in 1931, the use of ephedrine was the very first agent to ever be tried to treat excessive daytime sleepiness. That paled in comparison to the effects of amphetamines, which started in 1935. The second group, so we've got 60 years for the first segment of time. The second segment of time is half that, 29 years. And here you see a lot more discovery, a lot more input in terms of people who are now studying the brain and studying how the brain works in terms of its relationship to sleep. And probably one of the most important discoveries occurred in 1955. And this was out of the University of Chicago, where Kleitman and Aserinsky first identified rapid eye movement, REM. Then, shortly thereafter, in fact, 2 years later, Dement and Kleitman were the first to describe different stages of sleep. Not only did they identify REM sleep, but they also were able to break down non-REM sleep. Stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 in those days were what the designations were. Shortly after the discovery of the normal sleep staging, Yoss and Daly from the Mayo Clinic published a new paper on a review of narcolepsy up until that time, and they were the first to describe the 4 components, or at least the 4 known components at that time, and that is excessive daytime sleepiness, cataplexy, sleep paralysis, and hypnagogic hallucinations. That was 1957. That's part of my lifetime. So a few years later, in 1960, the very first paper for a substance to treat cataplexy was introduced. And that was the use of a tricyclic antidepressant called imipramine. And we still use it today. So this is 50 some odd years afterwards, we are still using this drug that was originally described in 1960. There were several papers that were then published on different chemicals and different drugs that showed promise in treating various aspects of narcolepsy. And then starting in around the late 1960s, early 1970s, people started to finally look at to see why people develop narcolepsy. And Merrill Mittler and William Dement in California found animals to have an equivalent disease. And the first species that was actively studied were Doberman pinschers. And these dogs exhibited a genetic pattern of inheritance with sleepiness and cataplexy. And if I didn't want to have another video, God forbid that we would have the technical problems, I'm glad I decided against it. But if you go to YouTube and you do a search for cataplectic animals, you will see a slew of videos on narcoleptic dogs and other animals as well. But the dogs with narcolepsy are classic. So go take a look at it. It's fascinating stuff. Shortly thereafter, in 1977, and this is a interesting thing because it was 3 years after I graduated medical school, Carskadden and Dement reported on the shortened sleep onset latency that was characteristic of narcolepsy. So in 1977, after I became a physician, we had a test to determine who did and who did not have narcolepsy. This is recent history. Think about it. And the codification of the MSLT occurred about a year later. And then in 1983, a group out of Japan did some fascinating studies on the genetics of the disease and found that patients who had narcolepsy with cataplexy, by far and away, 85 to 100%, depending on what population they studied, were positive for a specific HLA genotype. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is the last time frame. This is 17 years, going from 1998 to 2014, right up until today. And again, you see an explosion of discovery. And going back to the beginning of this particular time frame, in 1998 was the discovery of the orexin molecules, hypocretin orexin molecules. It was done in two centers. One was in Stanford, and the other one was in Dallas. The groups were looking at different things. The group in Dallas were looking for peptides in the brain that controlled appetite. And that's where the term orexin came from. Orexin means appetite stimulating. The group in Stanford, California, was looking for polypeptides that also could affect eating, metabolism, and perhaps sleep. And when they did the original assays of these unknown polypeptides, they thought that it had a very similar appearance to a known protein synthesis called secretin, which is a hormone secreted by the gut. And because they were looking in the hypothalamus, they contracted it and it became hypocretin. So that's how the two names came out. 6 months after these two papers, which appeared within 6 weeks of one another, it was discovered that the orexin and hypocretin were actually identical compounds. So when you see hypocretin and you see the word orexin, they mean the same thing. After that, in the late 1990s, going on into the 21st century, we had a huge number of discoveries and drugs that came on the market, and The first drug was modafinil, which was a unique alerting, promoting drug that did not have the major side effects of the amphetamines and Ritalin. It quickly became the drug of choice for patients with narcolepsy. It's not a perfect drug. Lots of people have side effects with it. And after that, going on data that had been accumulating in the late 1960s, 1970s, sodium oxybate was approved in 2002, and we know that compound as Xyrem, to treat cataplexy. In 2005, the FDA gave it an additional indication to treat excessive daytime sleepiness. And with that added indication, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine in 2007 came out with a standard of care designation for sodium oxybate to treat patients with narcolepsy who had either or excessive daytime sleepiness and cataplexy. Now, in 2007, Teva came out with, actually it was Cephalon, which was acquired by Teva, came out with armodafinil. Armodafinil is a purified form of modafinil. Every chemical compound has a left and a right-handed version of a chemical because they're mirror images. All chemicals are three-dimensional structures. So what they did was they took off all of the left-handed version of modafinil and kept the R version, the right-handed version, hence the name armodafinil. And they found that patients who took the R version were able to stay awake longer and had a better and longer period of resolution of their daytime sleepiness in the late afternoon. So that was the second drug that came out. And now, of course, it's a drug that is distributed and manufactured by Teva Pharmaceuticals. In 2010, a group of papers was looked at and noticed that there was a huge increase in the number of patients with narcolepsy and cataplexy following a pandemic of H1N1 flu in 2008-2009. This increase was seen across the world. It was first identified in China, and then quickly we saw it in Scandinavia, and then there were cases in the United States. A group of international narcolepsy researchers published letters to the editor to Sleep Journal that cautioned about not only was the disease narcoleptogenic, but there was a certain vaccine that seemed to actually have a greater incidence of the disease in people who received it. And this was a vaccine that was available only in the northern tier of Scandinavia. It was called Pandemrix. Pandemrix was one of the very first vaccines to come out to treat this pandemic. And Pandemrix had a substance in it that boosts the immunogenicity of the vaccine. And it was made from a specific shark cartilage, believe it or not. It was shark cartilage. It's called an adjuvant. And not all vaccines, most vaccines had different adjuvants. This particular one had this shark cartilage, and from a epidemiologic analysis, it was clear that those patients who received this Pandemrix vaccine had a greater incidence of the onset, acute onset, of narcolepsy with cataplexy. Further research found that almost 100% of these patients had HLA-0602 genotype, and that has spurred tremendous research since then on cause, effect, and potential treatment modalities. In 2013, a new drug was researched and published about out of Europe called pitolisant, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And then in 2014, a group of us, and I was one of the researchers, presented a presentation at the American Academy of Sleep Medicine this past spring on a drug called NO5. It was developed by Aerial Pharmaceuticals, and this drug was then purchased or co-directed with Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And the interesting thing about this particular drug is that it literally blew the socks off modafinil in terms of a wake-promoting agent. The increase in functioning, the increase in Epworth Sleepiness Scales, the increase in MSLT and MWT testing was quite remarkable. It was a small study, but it was enough to give the companies, Aerial and Jazz, enough information to want to go forward. So this is one of the items that we're going to be talking about as future treatments. So there I gave you the history of narcolepsy. That was what we call a run-through. Starting in 1877, right up until 2014. It's an amazing journey. But as you see, with each timeline, the number of breakthroughs doubles. So between 2014 and perhaps 2024, we're going to see huge numbers of new agents out there. We're going to be able to do what we call neuroimaging studies to be able to identify the parts of the brain and the chemicals in the brain and their locations on what we call functional MRI testing. So the future is incredibly bright for all of you. And my comment would be, stick to it. Okay, so now let's delve into narcolepsy from a 30,000-foot view. Narcolepsy is a lifelong neurologic sleep disorder, and there was one line in the European cartoon that you just saw that kind of surprised me. They said it's a curable disease, and I think they kind of missed that point when they were doing their final run-through. Unfortunately, it's not a curable disease. Right now, in 2014, it's not a curable disease. It's a lifelong disease. But there's some very interesting data that the Japanese researchers have looked at, and they seem to think as patients get older, the severity of the illness starts to decline, and in some cases precipitously declines, almost to the point where the patient becomes asymptomatic. So that's, again, something more to look forward to. That study was an epidemiologic study and is yet to be corroborated, but this was presented also at the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. I already spoke about how Yoss and Daly from Mayo talked about the narcolepsy tetrad. We now know it to be a pentad. There are 5 key parts of narcolepsy. Excessive daytime sleepiness, of course, cataplexy, hypnagogic hallucinations, sleep paralysis. And the last item is something that we are now looking into as being as significant, and that is disrupted nighttime sleep. Patients with narcolepsy, counterintuitively, do not sleep well at night, and I don't think I need to tell all of you that. But doctors don't realize that. Even sleep doctors hadn't realized that for a long time. And the FDA, when approving drugs to treat narcolepsy, excessive daytime sleepiness, and cataplexy, it wasn't even on their radar. Some of you were participants in the open forum that the FDA held in spring of 2013, in fall of 2013. And the one of 2 messages that got through to the FDA, which was fascinating. By the way, if any of you want to see that, it's available on the website. Just go to Open Narcolepsy Forum on the FDA website and you can see it. It was the fact that narcolepsy patients complain of 2 things that were heretofore never described. Number 1, disturbed nighttime sleep, and number 2, narcofog. And, you know, doctors who treat narcoleptic patients kind of looked at it and said, duh. And the doctors in the FDA were scratching their head and said, in fact, the head of the FDA turned to his colleagues and said, do you think we ought to look at this some more? That's exactly what he said. It was, it blew my mind, I'll tell you that. So people are realizing that there's a lot more to this syndrome than meets the eye. And I think that those people who participated in that group did a tremendous service to all of you. And my hat's off to them. And I know several of you were in that meeting. Now, not only are there sleep-wake issues that are associated with narcolepsy, there are also ancillary symptoms that aren't talked about as much. And these are automatic behavior, loss of concentration and memory, or what we call narcofog, and something which people almost always comment about, but we in the medical field never really look at it and address it specifically, and that is episodic visual symptoms. You focus your eyes because of voluntary muscles. You can have cataplexy of the muscles that control how you focus. And if patients are reading and their vision goes out of focus temporarily, that's the equivalent of a cataplectic attack as well. In 2013 and 2014, two major groups in the United States were looking to classify all disease states. One was the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, and the American Academy of Sleep Disorders, American Academy of Sleep Medicine, published new nosologies. The APA published the DSM-5, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine published the ICD-10-3. Both of them reclassified narcolepsy and the types of symptoms that are associated with it. And we'll talk about that as well. But for the second bullet point on this slide, you see there are two distinct groups. Those with cataplexy, which we're now calling type 1 via the ICSD-3 classification, and those without. And the best analogy I can give you is diabetes. Diabetes type 1 are those who have had it on a hereditary basis. You're born with it. The pancreas does not make insulin. And type 2 is the adult onset. So we're trying to look at narcolepsy now from an etiologic standpoint, that we believe that those patients who have cataplexy are a different breed than those who don't. And it may matter as we go on in terms of what the treatment will be to separate those two groups out. That remains to be seen. Now, the third point here is that narcolepsy does not occur in isolation. Narcolepsy has been associated with lots of other sleep disorders. Obstructive sleep apnea, it's been estimated that 25% of adult patients with narcolepsy have coexistent obstructive sleep apnea. Many times that patient is misdiagnosed as having only OSA because they're sleepy, they stop breathing, and even after they're put on CPAP or other treatment for their obstructive sleep apnea, they remain sleepy. And far too often the sleep community has been unable to differentiate those who have both from those who have individual diseases. RLS is enormously associated with narcolepsy. Restless legs. Periodic limb movements, which is associated with RLS, extremely common. Jerking, twitching, and kicking during the night can disrupt the sleep very easily. REM sleep behavior disorder. It's kind of interesting in that cataplexy is the loss of muscle tone during the day. REM sleep behavior disorder is just the opposite. It is dreamentation where, when you're asleep, that atonia of your muscles is preserved when you don't want it. So you're really mixed up. and you start to act out your dreams. I've had narcoleptic patients who have fallen downstairs. I've had narcoleptic patients who have attempted to go through a window. It can be very scary, and it needs treatment if the behavior has self-injurious properties. Very important to know. And the third is nocturnal eating disorder. I have lots of patients who sleepwalk into their kitchen and eat. They put on lots of weight, and it again causes more weight gain. And the interesting thing is when you're missing hypocretin-orexin, you gain weight, and that's why in kids you have an increase in body mass index and a very marked increase in obesity. But adults who develop nocturnal eating disorder start to get to the same place. And again, these are called parasomnias. They have to do with this confusional arousal interstate between stages 3 and 2, Neverland, and again, these are parts that we've never really even looked at in terms of being comorbid with the narcolepsy pentad. Now, everybody here is sleepy with narcolepsy. However, when you go to your doctor, and I think most of you will agree with me, you tell your doc, you know, I just can't function during the day. And you see here in the below bullet points, this is what your doctor comes up with reflexively. You're daydreaming, you're stressed, you've got insomnia. Are you taking drugs? Maybe you're depressed, maybe you've got bipolar. Maybe you're just apathetic and don't care. Maybe you have attention deficit disorder. Or if you've got cataplexy, maybe you've got seizures. I think everybody who with narcolepsy in this room has been told that at one time or another. And it's not wrong, but if a doctor has blinders on and that's all they think about, then that's wrong. Let's talk about cataplexy. Episodic weakness without altered consciousness. Very important. A cataplectic attack can go into sleep, but the initial manifestations of the muscle weakness require the individual to be awake and to be able to understand what's going on around them. Now, if you ask the average individual on the street, you know, what do you think cataplexy is? They'll tell you, oh, I'm talking to someone, and the next minute I tell them a joke, and they fall to the floor. If you ask many doctors, that's what they'll tell you. The fact is that only 30% of patients with narcolepsy with cataplexy have full-blown loss of axial muscle tone. 70% of cataplexy involves muscles above the waist. Drooping of the eyes, bobbing of the head, drooping of the shoulders, weakness in the arms. That's far more common than weakness of the legs with falling. And you see the little diagram that shows you the main muscles that are involved in cataplexy. In kids, the most common manifestation of cataplexy is weakness in the face. There are some very wonderful articles that were published out of Europe that actually gave this a name. They're called cataplectic facies, where the face becomes elongated, eyes tend to droop, jaw tends to fall. And that's a period of cataplectic facial weakness. If, as a neurologist, I was trained to do muscle diseases, and then the main muscle diseases are in kids. They're myotonic dystrophies or myopathies, congenital areas of metabolism in muscle. And in kids, we call that myopathic facies. And if you put two pictures up of a cataplectic facies and a myopathic facies together, and you don't tell the fellows or the residents what, they're not going to be able to make the difference. But the difference, of course, is a kid with myopathy doesn't get better. A kid with cataplexy will. So that drooping of the face is associated with slurring of their speech. And in fact, even if I ask adults who have cataplexy mainly involving the facial musculature, they will tell you that initially they will have difficulty articulating words. So it is a far more common aspect than we realize. The blurring of vision we spoke about, and I think everybody here understands that the most common trigger is laughter, positive emotions. But there can be negative emotions that can trigger cataplexy. Fright, anger, fear can, in some individuals, trigger it. So it doesn't have to always be laughter, surprise, or elation. It can be the negative aspects as well. Sleep paralysis, the inability to move for a few seconds or minutes during sleep onset and offset. Now, normal people who don't have narcolepsy can have sleep paralysis, and it occurs on an infrequent basis. The difference is narcoleptics have it on a far more frequent basis than normals. The thing that ends it is fear. When somebody, in fact, lots of people will tell you when they're paralyzed in bed, they have the sensation that they're falling, uncontrollably falling. It gets scary, and what happens when you get scared? You get an adrenaline surge. And it is adrenaline that triggers the resumption of normal muscle tone. And that is why the paralysis ends when the fear reaction kicks in. And it is that adrenergic stimulation, that adrenaline stimulation, is why certain drugs for cataplexy work better than others, because they augment this adrenergic or adrenaline input to the brain to break that muscle atonia. Hypnagogic hallucinations are fascinating because these are not the dreams that narcoleptics have. These occur during that transition when they're still partially awake, and they can be extremely frightening. If they occur while you're asleep, then it's a dream disorder. But the hypnagogic hallucination has to occur as you're transitioning into sleep, or normals have it when they're transitioning out of sleep. It may accompany sleep paralysis, and in fact, it doesn't have to be just a mental confabulatory image. People can feel, there can be tactile, auditory, or even unsonate smell parts of the hypnagogic hallucinations. I've had patients who have smelled funny things during these hallucinations, and the neurologist works them up for temporal lobe epilepsy, because one of the factors of temporal lobe epilepsy is abnormal smells. The difference is that it's always associated with the hallucination. If you have temporal lobe epilepsy, it's just a smell. So there are ways to differentiate it. Disrupted nighttime sleep is the last of the pentad that we really have looked at, and there was a very complete paper in 2013 that Tom Roth from Detroit was the senior author on. And he made some very cogent points about what this disrupted nighttime sleep is. Because patients with insomnia have terribly disrupted nighttime sleep. They wake up because they're light sleepers, and they can't fall back asleep. Narcoleptics wake up, but typically they don't have trouble falling back asleep, but the number of nocturnal awakenings is very, very great, and it can be quite annoying. And when we first started using sodium oxybate to treat patients, and we told them that they're going to have to wake up once to take the second dose, they looked and said, "Thank God." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because we wake up 10, 12 times anyway. If we now take that 12 and contract it to 1, hey, we're way ahead." And it's true. So you taught us something. When does narcolepsy start? One of the things that we're becoming very cognizant of is that, and for years we looked at narcolepsy as an adult disease. Well, that's not true because the vast majority of narcoleptics start in the pediatric age group. It may not be diagnosed until they're adults, but the symptoms start in the pediatric age group. And you see the age range from 5 to 63. That's a huge range. And the median age of 22 is at diagnosis. Most of the onset of symptoms occurs right at the time of puberty. And there are lots of research groups to look at the sensitivity of different autoimmune cells which get triggered by hormonal release that may be part of the cascade that disrupts and destroys the hypocretin cells in the hypothalamus. And puberty may be one of the triggers. So here you see onset of cataplexy typically occurs after the onset of sleepiness, hypnagogic hallucinations, ages 9, again, huge range to 65, and sleep paralysis kind of is within that hypnagogic range of 10 to 58. The graph on your right shows the peak incidence. It's a bi-peak, it's a bicameral distribution. The first peak occurs in the teenage years. The second peak occurs in the 20s and 30s. This is a fascinating slide because this looks at the onset of narcolepsy cataplexy on a yearly and monthly basis in China. Largest population in the world. And understand that most Chinese patients do not get the advanced kind of medical care that we get here. But they have an amazing data collection system, as you would expect. In the top graph, you see data going back to 1996, going all the way out to 2010. And it's not a straight line. There are peaks and valleys. The peaks are in the spring. The valleys are in the fall and winter. And the seasonal aspect of the onset of narcolepsy is important because one of the ideas that involves what is a trigger is flu. Well, when does flu hit? It hits in the winter. And then there is a latency period from the onset of the flu-like illness to the disruption of the hypocretin cells in the hypothalamus. So that delay means that there's a peak on incidence in the spring. And that's what you see in this slide. And if you look at the B graph, you will actually see how in the spring there is this increase in narcolepsy onset. And it falls dramatically in October, November, and December. And this pattern was consistent over greater than 10 years. So this is not just a fluke, this is a real epidemiologic pattern. The pattern persisted right up until 2009. And of course, what happened in 2009 was the H1N1 epidemic. Again, we took this out of supposition, and we believe that this is proof positive that the H1N1 is, in fact, a true trigger of narcolepsy. I think that everybody in this room understands that there is a worldwide underdiagnosis of the disease. In the United States, there are estimated 200,000 Americans with narcolepsy. There are only 50 to 55,000 have been diagnosed. 200,000 would put the incidence at approximately that of multiple sclerosis and just under Parkinson's disease. But Parkinson's disease and MS gets a lot more press, doesn't it? Well, I think this group is committed to right that wrong. We have to make better diagnoses. We have to be able to understand the complexity of the onset of symptoms and to be able to parse it out, to be able to separate out the symptoms and put it together. That's what good patient care requires. As you know, the onset of symptoms is 10 to 15 years before the correct diagnosis is made, and the average patient has seen 5 to 7 physicians. So now let's talk a little bit about narcolepsy and immunity, and that is the discovery of the HLA genes, and that was made by Honda in 1983. And here you see that 85 to 90% of patients with narcolepsy cataplexy carry the genes DQB10602. And if you don't have cataplexy, way less than 50% carry that genotype. The problem is that this is not a good diagnostic test because 12 to 38% of the general population carry the gene as well. Now, having this gene does not mean you have narcolepsy. But if you do have it, you stand a greater than 100 times greater chance of developing it. And the associations we've already spoken about, infection, immunization. What we didn't talk about is streptococcal infection, strep throat. And we are now looking at specific antibodies that the body produces that we believe lead to the destruction of these cells in the hypothalamus. We already talked about some of these factors that lead to the destruction. Having the gene, the 0601 gene, hormonal factors, onset at or near puberty, and the environmental factors, the triggers, H1N1 infection, pandemrix vaccination, or strep throat. How does this get on to the issue of destruction of those cells? The HLA genes are responsible for the production of specific proteins in the blood. And what they do is they bring together the factors that fight infection with the abnormal cells to get rid of the infection. But when the body recognizes their own cells as being foreign, you have this condition called autoimmunity. And it is that kind of trigger that will destroy those cells in the hypothalamus. There are also changes in T cell receptors, and T cells, as you know, is part of the system that we use to fight disease. T cells, of course, are non-functional in diseases like HIV/AIDS. But there are specific T cells that can and have been proven to attack hypocretin neurons. So this is indirect evidence, and it's very compelling. This is what a section of the brain of a narcoleptic looks like compared to a normal. The normal is on your right, the abnormal cells, the abnormal brain is on the left. And you see on the right that multitude of black little dots, that represents hypocretin neurons, and on the right, there are no neurons there. In the bottom two, you see what a cell body looks like connected to its dendrites, and you can see that there is about a 90% reduction in the narcoleptic brain. Our time is getting a little short, so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about those objective tests. I think everybody here knows what polysomnography is and MSLT testing. How many of you here have had a spinal tap? Okay, it's under 5%, which of course doesn't surprise me because not too many patients want or are anxious to have a needle put in their back. And there aren't too many labs out there that can actually process the spinal fluid to looking for hypocretin. But yet that is, in all of the designations, the most accurate way to diagnose the disease if you've got cataplexy. PS-GMSLT testing has to be done properly. If it's not, the validity of the test is diminished greatly. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this because I don't think time does not allow us to go into it in detail. This is the new classifications. This is actually the old one. This is the one that was printed in 2005. They talked about narcolepsy with cataplexy, and they talked about narcolepsy without cataplexy. These are the new classifications. 2013, the DSM-5, which was published by the American Psychiatric Association, actually says that if you've got documented cataplexy, you really don't need a PS-GMSLT. That is not the case with the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and here I have to side with the sleep docs. The reason is because if you have documented cataplexy, that will not satisfy your insurance company that you have narcolepsy. They need a piece of paper that says it. I wanted to send a CD-ROM with a video of patients having cataplexy, but my staff has told me that I'd be wasting time in postage because the insurance company wouldn't know what the hell to do with it. But yet they could read a MSLT report that says positive for narcolepsy. So unfortunately, in this day of insurance companies rule all, you still need the test, unfortunately, even if you have clear-cut, absolute, no question about it, cataplexy. So this is the Academy of Sleep Medicine criteria, narcolepsy type 1. You have to be able to have a positive MSLT or a positive CSF. And you have to have the positive MSLT has to show 2 sleep onset REM periods, but the big change is if you had a sleep onset REM at night, that counts as one of the 2 SOREMs. Narcolepsy without cataplexy is still a very hotly debated topic. We don't know if it's the same etiology, the same trigger, or even if it's the same disease. And this is going to be the conversations that are going to be going on for the next 2 to 3 years. There are equivocal situations. What happens when a patient has clear-cut cataplexy? Clinically, they're very sleepy, but their MSLT doesn't quite live up to the criteria. That happens very, very frequently. And frankly, in my lab, I repeat the MSLT up to 3 times. And after the 3rd MSLT, I have about a 97% success rate in making the diagnosis. There are people who can't follow instructions for the MSLT. They drink coffee in between tests. They go out and smoke. You name it, they do it. So these are problems inherent in the actual production of the test. All right, let's talk about a little, in the last 5 minutes, the goals of treatment. We want to reduce daytime sleepiness. We want to eliminate or reduce cataplexy, and we want to control the ancillary symptoms. We want to improve cognitive, psychosocial, and work functioning. After all, if we don't do that, we're not doing you any good. And we want to improve your safety and the safety of the public. There was a fascinating paper published 2 weeks ago on the number of pedestrian accidents in kids with narcolepsy who see a car coming down the street and don't react. This is part of the psychosocial milieu that we have to deal with. There was a fascinating survey done by Wake Up Narcolepsy, and I know the folks from Wake Up Narcolepsy are here today, that looked at over 2,000 respondents, and about 1,700 were analyzed. And here you see the breakdown. 62% were between the ages of 25 and 54. But look at the improvement. We have so much room for improvement for you. Only 42% on treatment had improved cognition, and only 52% had improved fatigue And these are on maximal doses of drug. And what this tells me is that we, as the medical community, have a huge road to go to make you feel better. There are behavioral treatments that we use. Naps during the day are very critical. Maintaining good sleep hygiene, not working shift work, very important. Regular bedtime, regular wake-up time. And to provide you with the psychosocial support that you need at school, with your family, at your job. People don't understand what narcolepsy is. So let me just get to the last part of this. These are the new agents. This is the future. Jazz right now is recruiting patients for a pediatric narcolepsy study. The big problem we have is that there are no drugs approved for the pediatric age group. We are now enrolling patients, and my lab is one of them, who are looking for patients between the ages of 7 and 17 who are narcoleptic with cataplexy and 0602 positive HLA status. Another study is being conducted for adults ages 18 to 55, not with Jazz, with a different pharmaceutical company, looking again for patients with cataplexy and narcolepsy. The drug pitolisant, which I mentioned earlier, is being investigated. It increases histamine in the brain, which is a wake-promoting neurochemical. Jazz is going to be working on a new formulation of Xyrem that has a little bit of a change. It's called deuterated. And Flamel, who is one of the sponsors here, is trying to develop a micropump for administration of Xyrem to only take it once during the night as opposed to having to take it in a split dose. There is also work on agents to increase or to agonize the GABA-A, which is the sleep-promoting neurotransmitters. And then there is some very interesting work on MCH, melanin-concentrating hormone, which actually are not affected in narcolepsy, but they actually run counter to orexin. And if we can antagonize MCH activity at night, we may be able to produce wakefulness during the day. So these are the ones that we still have lots of work to do, and that is the application of hypocretin in the brain and ways to inject hypocretin.
I get to ask it.
Okay. All right. So with that, I will stop, and I will very gladly accept your questions if you have any.
This is for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.